We're good. Okay, who here is tired from the time change? Okay, we're gonna do the best we can. We're gonna do the best we can. I promise. It's gonna be exciting. It's about protest. It's an exciting topic. If any of you want to protest me during the talk, I ask that you do so with the tactics I have already taught you. Don't do it badly. Okay, thank you very much. If you do it badly, I'm gonna kick you out. Okay, protest, the science of protest. I come from Faunalytics. We do research. Research usually is boring. Protest is not boring. So in theory, the research on protest should not be very boring. I personally am interested in analyzing the effectiveness and impact of certain tactics in the movement. This one is specifically about protest, obviously, but I have other issues about plant-based defaults, nudges, social media activism, vegan challenges, documentary, things like that. Some of them are published on the Faunalytics website, and some of them are still pending. Come on in, come on in. Very nice. Before I begin, I use essentially a literature review method to find out all of the evidence that's available in the movement, to summarize it, to make it easy to digest for people. I do want to shout out first that Faunalytics did not conduct the majority of the research I'm about to present. The Social Change Lab is actually probably the most important organization conducting research into protests. Sam is right here from that group. So if you're curious about this and want to read the studies, come read the research on Faunalytics and also check out their resources, because this presentation wouldn't truly be possible without their great work. So I want to shout them out first at the beginning. Okay, so first, before we understand impact, we have to understand goals. So how do advocates use protest and demonstration? I'm going to be using the term protest throughout this presentation. There are many different types of terms people use: protest, grassroots activism, in public, demonstration, things like that, but I'm going to be using protest. There are three primary uses. Number one is to pressure key decision makers. This could be politicians, corporations. You're trying to convince them to pass a law, trying to convince them to stop supplying an unethical farm, things like that. Number two is to spread awareness, to give information out. If something bad has happened about animal testing or something, you want to spread that out as far as you can, and protest can generate lots of media attention. The third is often under-discussed, actually, which is to cultivate activist talent. I want to ask, who here in this room thinks that they came into this movement as a result of protest, at least in part? Okay, it looks like maybe a fourth of the people here, anecdotally, have used protest as some sort of like entry point. I couldn't find any research to either prove or disprove this, but anecdotally, this seems true. I've asked this question multiple times, and it's usually around a third or a fourth of people. So in this way, protest is probably quite effective in cultivating talent. So then we have to look at the other two ideas: spreading awareness and pressuring people to make the decisions. So first of all, I want to talk about one goal that might not work, which is to convince people to go vegan. If you have a protest in a street and you're showing images of graphic footage or animals being harmed, is that going to convince people to reduce or eliminate their meat consumption? Oh, sorry, I'm skipping ahead. Sorry about that. So first of all, some background information. I'm doing great. Some background information. They're common, but usually not highly attended. This is data from the United States. About 40 to 80 every single week. This is likely an undercount because most protests are not officially counted. And they're unpopular. This is probably not a surprise to anybody. We tracked this ourselves, 2008 to 2017, multiple different tactics. Protest is always the least popular every single time, no matter if it's disruptive or non-disruptive. Yeah, they just view animal protests more negatively than protests of other causes, likely because the animal protection movement is not as popular as other justice causes, like racial justice or things like that. Okay, now I'm on the right place. What is the impact of protests? So this comes from a study that we did at Faunalytics. We looked at 16 different advocacy interventions. I'm going to explain this. It's a lot of information. Unfortunately, protest is the least likely out of 16 to make people eat less meat. Out of 16. It is the most likely to make people angry at animal activists. And then we have a couple over here. It's 13th most likely to increase sympathy for animal suffering, and the 12th most commonly experienced in person. I'll let you all take a little photo here. So it's not looking good, is it? Not looking good for protest. Makes people angry, doesn't make them reduce their meat consumption. I'm going to give you some more bad news. All have taken pictures. Not only does it not make them reduce their meat consumption, it increases their meat consumption. So it can actually have a backfire effect. Disruptive protests and non-disruptive protests actually increase the servings of meat consumption after the intervention. This is the only one to have done this in a significant way. So, not ideal, is it? I'm seeing lots of cameras. I'll pause here. And one more graph. It also doesn't make people more likely to sign a petition as compared to the other interventions that we analyze in our resources. This study comes from, it's called relative effectiveness. We looked at the 16 different interventions. If you're interested in intervention analysis, I strongly recommend you read the entire thing. We looked at everything. We looked at labeling, we looked at books, we looked at documentary, we looked at classroom education. It came out in 2002 on the Fonalytics website. So shout out to that study from my colleague, Andrea. So it's not looking good. We can't really make people go vegan with protests, at least not in the current climate that we're in. So that's it. No more protests. We're done. No more protests. We can all go home. No, I'm kidding. That doesn't mean that protest is inherently a bad tactic. It means that it should not be used to shift diet. This comes from the Social Change Lab. In this study, they found that the backfire effect kind of went down months after the protest had subsided. So that's some potential good news here. The only one that didn't really change that much was attitude towards vegans and veganism. This makes sense given the slides I just showed you about how this makes people angry at animal activists themselves. But 6 months after the protest, they believe that society has a broken relationship with animals. We should change how we use animals for entertainment and things like that. Okay, so now we're seeing some positives here. It's looking like even if it's not going to make them go vegan, it might be able to shift their attitudes more generally, as long as they get some time to kind of get over it, for lack of a better term. So I also wanted to draw on some evidence from other social movements here, because there's not all that. Sometimes we need to look at other social movements to figure out what is and isn't working, how that could translate to our movement. And it's pretty conclusive that protests can change voting patterns more generally. So Black Lives Matter, in one study, for every 0.1% of people who attended a protest, Democrats, the left-leaning, supposedly, political party in the United States, received a 0.35% voting day boost. So this is a good correlation. If you're more likely to protest in the county, you're more likely to receive voting boosts later on. And the same with the Tea Party. Who knows what the Tea Party is? Yeah, okay, they're really, really right-wing in the United States. They're not really around anymore. But around this time period, they had a lot of protesting. For each 0.1% increase, we see a 1.9% change. So it's even higher for Republican votes, which is the right-leaning party in the United States, in case you don't know. So we can see protest is able to make people more likely to vote, or more likely to vote for that specific cause, likely to generate people to vote in that way. So that's good. When animal issues are on the ballot, we can use protests in that way. They're not always on the ballot, of course, and there are not always that many pro-animal politicians that we can kind of rally behind. But it's good to keep in mind that this can change real-world consequences. So this is something to keep in mind. It is very likely that the impact of protests is correlated with the overall popularity of the cause it is representing. That's why we see Black Lives Matter is able to shift public consciousness in 2020. Notice that happened in 2020, Black Lives Matter has been around since about 2013, I believe, but it wasn't able to actually shift voting patterns until 2020 when it became more popular. This implies, I'm not going to say I'm 100% sure about this, but it's likely that as animal rights becomes more popular in specific regions, protest may become a more effective tactic as well. So in places where animal rights is popular or specific niche issues within animal rights, like for example, like our last presentation about cosmetic testing, which is pretty unpopular for most people, that is more likely to have an effect. Same with things like, I believe fox hunting here is extremely unpopular, right, in the UK. A protest against that is more likely to be impactful than a protest against something that is popular, like, you know, eating meat, for example. So if we're thinking in terms of decades, protests might become more important later on in certain countries. This is still relatively theoretical, but I think it's important to think strategically. So we should make the targets of protest correlate to public opinion within the country. You shouldn't protest something that 95% of Britons support. It's unlikely to kind of get as much impact. If 45% of Britons support something, then we're kind of in the right territory there. So this is something to keep in mind. Understanding public opinion is difficult, but it's going to require a little bit of research. It's going to require some research. If you have questions about this, you can come to Faunalytics and we can help you understand public opinion polling a little bit more. There we go. I'm going to pause here. I don't personally prefer using the app. I kind of want to just ask questions in the room. So I'm going to pause and ask, does anybody have questions about anything I presented on so far? Yeah, we did that as well. I didn't put it in the graph, but it did increase compared to no intervention. Yeah, good question. Correlational because of the way researchers examine the question. We can't really do. It's not like we told, some researchers told Black Lives Matter activists to target these districts and not these districts, because that would be a causational study. So just because protest is so difficult to study, it has to be correlational in this specific instance. However, the fact that we've seen so many correlational results here does indicate something, but you're right, it doesn't necessarily mean protest is the only thing that caused those boosts, right? Yeah. Yeah. This is called the 3% rule, 3.5% rule. What's the name of the researcher? Erica Chenoweth. Thank you very much, Erica Chenoweth. I personally don't think it relates to the vegan movement that much because primarily her research is about authoritarian regimes, and I don't know, maybe in the US it'll work, but at least not in the UK. Yeah, but the population doesn't think that way. That's the point. I mean, yeah, I don't think the 3.5% rule applies. Yeah, I mean, obviously, the more education and more outreach, the better for the vegan movement. I don't think the 3.5% rule is applicable in this instance just because the targets are different than the research study from Erica Chenoweth. But the idea of a tipping point is quite interesting. I haven't seen any sufficient data about what that would be. Maybe I would say it's probably a lot larger than 3.5%. Yeah. Which stats? The majority of this research tends to take place in Europe and North America. With our Phonalytics research, it was nationally representative. I believe most of the other ones was nationally representative as well. I don't remember off the top of my head. It was a couple thousand. Yeah. Yeah, it was not a focus group. It was a large sample. I'm going to keep going for now, and we'll have another round of questions at the end, okay? So I'll make sure to get to it. Okay, so how can we improve? So at this point, protests can't make people go vegan, but it might be able to do other things. Shift voting patterns, make people move away from certain companies, things like that. Oh yeah, okay, don't use violence, please. Please don't do that. Not only is it, I would argue personally, unethical, it's not effective most of the time. It's just the backlash is going to be so severe that any campaign target is just not going to work. Pick your goal carefully. This is going back to what I was saying earlier. You should be picking things that are supported by a small majority of the public. It shouldn't be super, super niche for protest. If it's super niche, you might want to be looking at things like education or social media or more awareness campaigns like that. I'm personally working on a database of public opinion polls at Phonalytics. This is a big project. I'm hoping to finish it by December, hopefully. And ideally, this would be a resource for any protest or campaign group in general to pick the specific goals and targets for their campaigns. Number 3 is to track your effectiveness. You should think of some dependent variables that you can track. If you do a protest in a certain area, is there a way you can see the impact on the public more generally? I've come up with a couple of ideas. This comes from other literature and my conversations with protesters. Number of news articles, headline sentiments. So how positively or negatively are the articles themselves? Are they framing vegans as, for lack of a better term, crazy radicals, or are they, meaningful contributors to society? Number of social media shares, opinions of people who watch the protest, signups to your cause, visits to your website, and donations. The Social Change Lab, for example, uses a number of these as variables in their research. I think protest groups themselves can do some research to figure out which types of their protests are working and which ones aren't working. That way you can actually tailor your own strategy as you're going. I'll pause for pictures. Number 4 is have a media plan. This is critical. Because the effect of protest is mitigated through the media, you need to take the media impact very seriously. So this is research from the Social Change Lab that where you hear about the protest changes how supportive you are of the protest itself. This is the graph here. This includes not just media outlets, but other things like your education or friends and family. But you can see here the Guardian has a more positive estimate of the protest and the protesters as compared to the Telegraph, for example. So this, to me, proves pretty decisively that, or at least it correlates that the way the protest is being talked about in the media is going to change how it impacts people's public perceptions of it. So we need to take it seriously. You need to have spokespeople, communicators, press releases. You need to portray your story in an effective way to the press. Most people won't see it on the streets. I live in Barcelona. Who here has heard about a protest that happened last year in Barcelona? A specific one with water guns? Has anybody heard of this? Yeah, okay, you know what I'm talking about, right? They were spraying tourists with water guns, okay? That got a lot of media attention, okay? I live in Barcelona. There were probably 50 protests that summer that were around, and none of them generated international publicity to that extent. That actually got a lot of backlash. A lot of people are very angry at Spaniards and Catalonians for that reason. But it does kind of show that the way it's mitigated through the media changes the impact here. Ideally, your protest would have a high action logic. In other words, the actual form of the protest is related to the goal that you're trying to convey. The Social Change Lab is actually currently researching this right now. I think there's some more findings that'll come out pretty soon. But ideally, if you see, like, here's the heuristic, the rule of thumb. Imagine you're flipping through news channels and you see evidence of a protest for 5 or 6 seconds. Are you able to understand the goal of the protesters in 5 to 6 seconds? Or is it just really unclear what's happening? For example, throwing blood or fake blood on a fur coat has a high action logic because it's clear what you're actually angry at. You're angry at the fur coat. Whether or not that protest is going to be effective is different, but the action logic is there, right? So we want to think critically as protesters if the protest form matches the goal. Okay? Okay, finally, this is my favorite topic of all, the radical flank effect. Who here knows what the radical flank effect is? Okay, about maybe a fourth. So, the radical flank effect. You need to be thinking about your role in the entire movement, okay? This conference is actually a good way to coordinate this. In the radical flank effect, the existence of a moderate group and an extreme group make people more likely to support the moderate group because it makes them seem more reasonable by comparison. In other words, if you're walking along the street and somebody throws fake blood on someone's coat right in front of you, you think, if you're non-vegan at least, you think to yourself, oh, this person's crazy. They don't know what they're talking about. This is unbelievable. How dare they harm people that way? But then the next day you read a news article about, a nice, respectable person maybe wearing a suit talking about why it's important to use alternatives to fur. And you think, okay, at least like this guy, he kind of gets it, okay? Like he's talking to me in a way I understand. Maybe I won't buy a fur coat for Christmas this year. That's the radical flank effect in theory. So is it true? Let's look at some evidence. I'll get back to that in a second. It is true. When people who see a moderate and a radical group, they have more support for the moderate group as opposed to people who saw 2 radical groups or 2 moderate groups here. This evidence is this is basically a Likert. It's like the 4.212 is how much are you likely to support this group on a scale from 1 to 7. So it does increase it. This was from a randomized controlled trial. This is causational data. Secondly, what is specifically making people support that group? It appears it is radical tactics, not a radical agenda. So when you show people a group with radical agenda and radical tactics, it's actually not quite as effective as a group with a moderate agenda and radical tactics. In other words, it doesn't matter if you're trying to abolish all animal farming in the world or just say a moratorium on factory farming. It's the tactics themselves that are the most critical to whether or not you are perceived as radical. So this is where disruptive protest can come in. This is the key of disruptive protest, is you are able to basically make the moderate groups like Mercy for Animals or something like that seem more mainstream. Another term that might be thrown around is you're shifting the Overton window. You're making something seem more reasonable by comparison. What's critical is that the moderate group and the extreme group need to be completely different. They can't be 2 arms of the same group, and they can't really be seen in public together. They shouldn't be associated. Otherwise, people aren't going to have the same effect. So what does this mean? It means we should be, as animal activists, using these conferences to kind of coordinate strategy on kind of behind the scenes. And then in public, you have 2 different groups, one of which is moderate and one of which is radical. And the protest group should know which one you are. Are you the radicals or are you the moderates? You should have a theory and you have to coordinate it. Okay, so then another critical thing is salience. You want to make sure that the time and location of the protest is most likely to increase the salience and the action logic of the protest itself. So these are some ideas from the literature. if you just go to a random street that's popular, it might not be as important as choosing like something related to your cause. Like if you're protesting a corporation, protesting outside the corporate headquarters is more likely to generate interest. You also want to protest at a time when you're more likely to get salience. So maybe it's the corporation's anniversary, or maybe they're announcing a new product line of meat that you find unethical and you're trying to get them to stop. Something to get media attention and make it more clear what you're trying to do, as opposed to just a busy intersection. Remember, the impact of protest is through media, not from onlookers. So the amount of people who see the protest is not as important as how it's mitigated in the media ecosystem. Finally, make sure the attendance is high. This is data from the United States, but the median attendance is 7 people. This number kind of shocked me, actually, because many protests are just a few people outside of a supermarket. I don't know the numbers for the UK, unfortunately. It might be higher. I just don't know. But ideally, the more people, the better. Also, this is median, not average, by the way. So the average is likely higher than that. And finally, collaborate. We believe that protests can be used to generate interaction between other social movements, especially climate, food justice, and sometimes even racial justice if it's issues of factory farming harming communities. And we haven't really seen that being used very much in the animal movement. And I think this is basically theorized to be an underappreciated tactic here. So why not collaborate with other groups? You could even use the radical flank effect with other groups, make ourselves the radicals, and like a climate group, the moderate group, collaborate behind the scenes that way. Could be very, very impactful. Okay, we're gonna get to questions. Oh, if you have questions, come to our office hours where we can answer questions. But if you have questions now, you can ask me. So any questions? Yes?
For the bits where you talked about the effectiveness and like the media, I feel like British media tends to skew much more right-wing than the US, and I was wondering if like everything that, like all the stats you mentioned and stuff were based off of the US versus
The media?
Yeah, because like media here like will always be like, crazy animal terrorists and stuff, and like
Right.
and like it'll like it like every mainstream media will always use that as that. So I don't really.
The U.S. media is pretty right-wing too. I'll say that. But I see your point of the Social Change Lab does work in the UK, so that graph was specifically from the UK. But the overall theory is, and the strategy is the same. Regardless of whether or not your country is leaning conservative or liberal, your strategy should be to figure out ways to present yourself in the media better. Sometimes that means you might want to get smaller publications that are more niche and try to promote that as opposed to larger publications. That's where action logic can be helpful. And here's the thing, there always is going to be backlash to protest. That's just kind of how it works. You need to be thinking of, are you trying to be the radical flank and make another group seem better? If so, it actually might be good for you to be seen that way. Secondly, if there's going to be a backlash, you can try to mitigate it through the media as much as you can, but there always is going to be some sort of backlash. That's just how protest works. It doesn't mean it's not going to work entirely. You just have to figure out how you're going to make your internal theory of change match that. One really quick question.
So firstly, when you're going through these, all of these conclusions about effective protests, was this based on specifically protests of animals?
Yeah.
Or, okay.
It was all animals, yeah.
Okay, all animals. The second question I had was when you were talking about the moderate.
Radical flank effect?
Yeah, with the radical tactics. So the thing is, I was looking at the bars and I'm just not reading. Like, how significant was that difference?
It wasn't as significant as the radical group itself. Okay, so I'm not going to say it's the end-all be-all, but if you're like designing a protest group, I would say the tactics will be more important than the agenda, but it's not like the top thing you need to be considering. Yeah. Okay, we are out of time. If you want to ask me more questions, I'll be hanging around. By the way, thank you so much for filling up the room. That makes me feel good. Thank you.